The wind, a relentless scythe, scraped across the skeletal branches of the pine forest, howling around the fragile structure that offered little true shelter. Inside the one-room cabin, Elara huddled closer to the dying embers in the hearth, the threadbare blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. The cold seeped into her bones, a constant, aching companion since Silas had been taken by the fever, and then, worse, since the silence of his passing had been compounded by the silence of abandonment. Those who had offered condolences had quickly vanished, unwilling or unable to bear the burden of a young widow on the fringes of nowhere, with winter settling its unforgiving hand upon the land. Her world had shrunk to the confines of these drafty walls and the brutal landscape beyond the single, frost-webbed window. Hunger was a dull, persistent ache, sharpening at unpredictable moments into a gnawing desperation. Fear was a cold stone lodged in her gut, heavy and constant. Fear of the wild, yes, the wolves she'd heard howling closer each night, the bears preparing for slumber but still a threat in their hunger. But also fear of people. The distant town felt like a different world, full of eyes that had pitied, then judged, then simply turned away. She was alone, utterly, terrifyingly alone. Beyond the thin wall of logs, muffled by the wind's roar, she sometimes heard sounds. The sharp, rhythmic thwack of an axe biting deep into wood, the distant crack of a rifle shot. These sounds didn't belong to her. They belonged to the man who lived deeper in the woods, a recluse known only as Jedediah. He was a figure of local legend, whispered about in hushed tones, wild, dangerous, a man who preferred the company of trees and silence to human interaction. His presence, though unseen, added another layer to her fear. He was an unknown quantity, potentially as dangerous as any beast. She had seen him once, a tall, shadow-like figure moving through the trees at the edge of her clearing before Silas died. His gaze direct and unsettling. She avoided looking towards his part of the woods now, though the sounds of his solitary existence were sometimes the only proof that she wasn't the last person left on earth. The days blurred into a cycle of cold, hunger, and the desperate search for meager fuel for the fire. Her hands were raw and chapped from wrestling with frozen kindling. Her body ached with weariness. Sleep offered little respite, often broken by nightmares or the sounds of the night pressing in. Survival was a relentless battle, fought moment by moment against the elements and the crushing weight of her own isolation. She felt her strength draining away, like water through cupped hands. The resilience she had thought she possessed felt thin, fragile, threatened with snapping under the strain. Every creak of the cabin, every shift of the wind, every distant howl sent a fresh wave of terror through her. The world outside was a predatory place, and she was its vulnerable prey. She wondered how long she could endure before the cold, the hunger, or something else entirely, claimed her. The thought was not entirely unwelcome in her darkest moments. It would be an end to the suffering. But something stubborn, a tiny ember of defiance within her, refused to extinguish completely. Not yet. Days bled into weeks, each sunrise a challenge met with weary eyes. Elara rationed the last of her dried beans, each mouthful tasting like ash. The wind continued its mournful dirge, occasionally punctuated by the sharp report of Jedediah's rifle. She still heard him sometimes, the steady rhythm of his labor a stark contrast to her own desperate struggle. She would watch him from the corner of her eye if he was visible through the trees, a dark, solitary figure moving with a quiet efficiency she envied. He built things, chopped wood with powerful, economic strokes, moved through the snow with a confidence that spoke of deep knowledge of the wild. He seemed a part of the harsh landscape, molded by it, while she felt like a trespasser, fragile and out of place. Her fear of him hadn't entirely dissipated, but it had changed. It was still there, a prickle of unease, but it was overlaid now with a grudging respect for his ability to simply exist in this unforgiving place. He was self-sufficient, beholden to no one, a stark contrast to her own dependency, first on Silas and now, precariously, on her own failing strength. She had seen him once, through the trees, stop and look towards her cabin. He hadn't approached, hadn't even lingered long, but the moment had felt charged, as if he were assessing the situation. She hadn't moved, barely breathed, until he was gone. It was unnerving, this awareness of being observed by eyes that gave away nothing. One morning, after a particularly brutal night, she found a stack of freshly cut firewood neatly piled near her cabin door. It was green wood, not ideal, but it was wood nonetheless. She knew, with a certainty that bypassed logic, that it had been Jedediah. No one else came this way. He hadn't announced his presence, hadn't asked for anything, had simply left it there. It was an act that defied her expectations of the wild recluse, confusing the simple narrative she had built of him being a danger. The wood was a lifeline, undeniable proof that her struggle had been seen, if not acknowledged. She felt a complex mix of emotions, relief that bordered on tears, a wave of shame at needing such charity, and a deeper confusion about the man who offered it in silence. She still didn't approach him, didn't call out thanks. The unspoken nature of the gesture seemed important, a boundary he hadn't crossed, and she wouldn't either. Yet, the wood burned in her hearth, a small, defiant warmth against the encroaching cold, bought by an act of anonymous, unexpected kindness. The days grew shorter, the sun a pale, weak disk in the frigid sky. A blizzard, predicted by the heavy stillness of the air and the darkening clouds, was fast approaching. Alara knew she wasn't ready. Her dwindling supplies were critical. The cabin offered insufficient protection against a storm of that magnitude, and her strength was at its nadir. The gnawing fear in her gut intensified, no longer a stone, but a clawing beast. That afternoon, as the first heavy flakes began to fall, large and soft like cotton before the wind tore them into icy needles, she heard a different sound. Not the axe, not the rifle. It was a low, guttural growl from just beyond the cabin wall. Panic seized her. It was a wolf, drawn perhaps by desperation, or by the scent of lingering humanity and vulnerability. She scrambled away from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Another growl, closer this time, followed by the scrape of claws against the rough logs near the door, tested the wood, seeking weakness. She backed into the corner furthest from the door, clutching a heavy, broken chair leg, a pitiful weapon against teeth and claws. The growling intensified, a hungry, terrifying sound that vibrated through the floorboards. She could hear its snuffling breaths, the raw power of the creature just outside her flimsy barrier. Then a violent lunge against the door. The wood groaned, a split appearing near the latch. It wouldn't hold. Not against that strength, that determination. Terror, pure and absolute, ripped through her. It was the end. The cold, the hunger, the loneliness, none of it mattered now. This was the immediate, visceral threat, and she was utterly defenseless. A sound tore from her throat, involuntary, raw, a shriek born of primal fear and the certainty of impending death. It was a sound that held all the despair and terror of her past months, amplified by the present danger. The wolf outside paused for a fraction of a second at the sound, startled. Then it resumed its assault on the door, harder now. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable splintering wood, the rush of cold air, the tearing teeth. Suddenly, another sound cut through the storm and the wolf's snarls. The sharp crack of a rifle, not aimed at the cabin but at the creature outside. The wolf yelped, a surprised, pained sound, and scrambled away from the door. There was a thrashing in the snow just outside. Another growl, weaker this time. Then silence, save for the wind and the drumming of her own frantic heartbeat. She stayed frozen, chair leg raised, breath coming in ragged gasps. Then, a voice, deep and rough, called out, muffled by the storm. Inside! Stay inside! It was Jedediah. The shock of hearing his voice, of his sudden intervention, was almost as potent as the fear had been. She didn't move, listening. She heard heavy boots crunching in the snow just outside, the sound of something being dragged away from the door. The blizzard was intensifying, the wind now a raging torrent. After a tense silence, there was a firm knock on the door, not tentative, not demanding, but certain. She hesitated, her hand trembling on the chair leg. But the wolf was gone, and it was his rifle shot that had sent it away. Slowly, uncertainly, she lowered the chair leg. She fumbled with the frozen latch, her fingers stiff with cold and fear. When the door finally creaked open, a blast of icy wind filled the cabin, swirling snow inside. Standing on the threshold, a dark, solid figure against the white fury of the storm, was Jedediah. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face weathered and lined. His eyes, when she finally met them, were a clear, steady gray, assessing. He held his rifle loosely in one hand, and there was a smear of dark blood on the snow behind him where the wolf had been. He didn't speak, simply stepped inside, bringing with him the biting cold and the scent of pine and snow. He looked around the cabin, taking in the meager fire, the bare shelves, the signs of deep privation. His gaze lingered on her for a moment, then shifted away. "Storm's going to be bad," he stated, his voice quiet but carrying a weight of certainty. "Cabin won't hold against it like this." He gestured towards the split door, the gaps in the walls she had tried to stuff with rags. "You need better shelter." He didn't wait for a response, didn't offer sympathy or explanation for his presence, other than the implied necessity of the situation. He simply began to act. He moved with a quiet competence, reinforcing the door with a spare log from her small pile, chinking the larger gaps in the walls with speed and efficiency. He worked without fuss, his movements economical and strong. Alara watched him, still trembling slightly, the adrenaline slowly receding to leave behind a vast exhaustion and a bewildered sense of relief. She had screamed into the void, and an unexpected hand had reached back. He had saved her life. The stoic, feared recluse had risked himself to defend her against the wild. As the storm raged outside, shaking the cabin walls, Jedediah finished securing what he could. He added some of the green wood he had left earlier to her fire, the damp logs hissing defiantly. He looked at her again, his expression unreadable. "My place is sturdier," he said, finally breaking the silence. "It's closer than trying to reach town in this. You can wait out the worst there." It wasn't a question, but a simple statement of fact, a practical solution offered without ceremony. The old fear of him warred with the overwhelming gratitude and the chilling knowledge of her own vulnerability if she stayed here. She looked at his steady eyes, remembering the silent gift of wood, the timely rifle shot. She nodded. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling inadequate against the magnitude of his actions. He simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod in return. The trust, so slowly earned through observation and circumstance, had been forged in an instant of shared peril. She gathered her few possessions, the worn blanket, a tin cup, the last of her meager supplies, and stepped out into the raging blizzard, following the silent figure who had come from the woods and saved her life, and perhaps, in doing so, offered a way back from the brink of her own despair. Walking through the storm towards Jedediah's cabin was like entering a different world, one carved out of the wilderness with strength and knowledge. His cabin was small, built solid and low against the wind, smoke curling steadily from its stone chimney. Inside, it was sparse but warm, organized with the practical precision of someone who needed everything to serve a purpose. There were shelves lined with jars of preserved food, traps and tools hung neatly on the walls, a large, well-tended fireplace that radiated comforting heat. It was the antithesis of her own crumbling, desperate existence. He didn't fuss over her, simply indicated a place by the fire where she could sit and offered her a mug of hot, weak tea. The silence between them was heavy, but no longer entirely fearful. It was filled with the unspoken acknowledgement of what had just occurred, and the necessary reality of their shared space in the face of the storm. Alara drank the tea, feeling the warmth spread through her chilled body, a profound sense of safety settling over her for the first time in months. She looked at Jedediah, who sat across from her, cleaning his rifle with deliberate movements. He was not the wild man of rumor, but a man of action, quiet strength, and unexpected compassion. His solitude wasn't born of malice, she realized, but perhaps a choice, or the result of circumstances she didn't know. As the storm howled its fury outside, rattling the solid logs of his cabin, Alara began to speak, hesitant at first, then the words spilling out of Silas's illness, of the quick abandonment, of the relentless struggle and despair. Jedediah listened, his gaze steady, offering no interruptions, no facile words of comfort, just the quiet presence of a witness. It was enough, more than enough. In sharing the burden of her story, some of its crushing weight began to lift. He didn't need her pity, her judgment, or her help. He had simply seen a creature in distress and acted. And in turn, he had shown her that even in the deepest isolation, connection could find you. Resilience could be sparked by the simple fact of being seen and aided. The storm passed, leaving behind a world buried deep in snow, sparkling under a clear, cold sun. Alara didn't immediately leave Jedediah's cabin. Necessity dictated they wait for the snow to settle. But even after the path back to her own cabin became passable, something had shifted. The raw, desperate fear was gone, replaced by a quiet determination. She was still alone in the world, in a sense, but she wasn't entirely forsaken. She had faced the wolf, both the one at her door and the one of her own despair, and survived. And she had learned that strength could come from unexpected places, and that bravery wasn't just the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. Jedediah, the silent, capable man from the woods, had saved more than just her life that night. He had saved her capacity for hope, for connection, for believing that even in the harshest landscape, dignity and a quiet, shared resilience could take root and flourish. The path ahead was still uncertain, but she would walk it now with a strength she hadn't known she possessed, no longer just surviving, but truly facing the future, one steady step at a time, in a world that felt just a little less cold, a little less empty.